Hey, I'm Jay, and this is everything you'll ever need to know about topology. All right, so we're gonna get super nerdy in this video, all right? So if you're into 3D modeling, getting better at 3D modeling, making characters, that sort of thing, stay tuned. Hopefully you find some useful info in this video. If you're not really into those sort of things, to go into like a deep dive, then this video is probably not going to be for you. My goal is to make this video packed with all the useful information on topology, address kind of the most common questions, misconceptions, and mistakes that I've seen throughout my years modeling and teaching, and trying to make a video that just encapsulates the whole everything you need to know about topology that I could send to people, that you can send to people. So I just want to be on my channel for all time, an overview of what topology is, how you can make it better, and how it can help you be a better modeler. I've separated the video into chapters down below, so you can skip around if you want to get info on a specific topic or refer to something in the future. Okay, so first up, what is topology? Seems like we should start there. So let's define topology. Also referred to as edge flow. Topology is the term used for the arrangement of the verts, edges, and faces of a 3D model. All of the verts of a 3D model are connected by edges, and those edges are like the scaffolding that make up the faces, which is the actual shell of the model itself. The faces of the model is what you see, and the topology is like the web that holds everything together. 3D artists starting out usually don't think enough about topology, or on the other hand, some artists think about it way too much, kind of overthink it. So we're going to try to describe what makes good topology, what makes bad topology, and try to talk about the things you don't really need to worry about and the things that are best to focus on. Okay, so why is topology important anyway? Like, why do you need to care about it if you're a 3D modeler? I think of three main reasons. Number one is the polycount. The topology is the mesh, so it is what determines the polycount. Now, I'm a character artist in the game industry. That's like my day job. So polycount is more important to me than other types of modeling, let's say, because it has to run at real time and with all the other assets in a game. So it's something that I think about maybe a little bit more so than if you're modeling for a different reason. But polycount's important no matter what kind of thing your model is for, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think number one is polycount. You don't want to have a bunch of faces that aren't doing anything. You know, you don't want to be wasteful, and you need to have enough to make your model look good. So it's all about this balance, which we'll talk more about too, of getting the model right to do what it needs to do and also fit under your budget for whatever you're doing. Okay, so number one, polycount. Okay, second reason why topology is really important is deformation. So especially if you're making characters, characters are meant to move, right? They're meant to perform. So the topology is the actual mesh that's animating your final product that you make as a modeler. So not only do you have like simple joints, which are pretty straightforward, but you have things like a face, you know, that can make all these like squishy, squashy poses. And so it's really important that you build your mesh in a way that does everything that it needs to do, which is like renders correctly, it's nice and smooth, and then can be manipulated and deformed by technical animators and animators to give a performance. You know, as a modeler, that's kind of the ultimate, is that you can make a mesh that, when collaborating with others, can come to life and give a performance. So it's important that your topology can deform well in a believable way, in a naturalistic way, to do what your model is meant to do. I don't want to make it sound harder than it is. We're going to talk about just a few of the key principles you need to keep in mind when you are building a mesh that's meant to animate and deform. So we'll look at some examples a little bit further in the video. Again, don't want to make it sound like it's, you know, super hard. It's just a couple things you need to be keeping in mind and pay attention to when you're building those meshes. Okay, third reason, maybe the most important reason, is how it looks. The topology that you build is your mesh, so how smooth it is, how detailed it is, whether or not the, you know, maybe parts of a costume are detailed. And so the modeling there is what will make it look realistic. If you're making a game model, it's whether or not the silhouette looks jagged or smooth. You know, how it's shading, how it's rendering, what is actually 3D, what is texture. So this is all going to be part of like a balance that you're considering as you build your model for whatever it's doing. So having a good understanding of topology is going to help you to make better meshes that are the correct poly count and under budget, can deform well and animate, and look good when they're rendered nice and smooth. Okay, now let's talk about a few of the most common ways that you will be making meshes, thus making topology, generating topology, and kind of the stages of how involved you have to be and how specific topology would need to be and for what reason.
Okay, so let's talk about making topology. All right, so there's two main ways to make topology. That's procedurally and manually. So let's first talk about procedurally. So procedurally, obviously, automatic. That's its strength. It's doing a lot for you. A lot of people may not be thinking of it this way, but Dynamesh and Z-Remesher are procedural and they're fast, and that's the strength, is you're giving up control for speed. And this makes it quick to iterate. That's why this is awesome and used all at the beginning. So you can use it to make base meshes, even more refined meshes with Z-Remesher. Something that's really good is with Z-Remesher, as opposed to Dynamesh, is you can give it some control. So Dynamesh is just throwing topology at your meshes, which again is fine for like building quick shapes. But then typically I'll be transitioning to Z-Remesher. It gives better topology for the shape, whereas Dynamesh is totally agnostic of the shape. So Z-Remesh will help support the shape. You'll get better topology that way. And you can control it a little bit. You know, you can have polygroups and say, keep these groups and kind of control it in that way. You can also kind of manipulate the mesh because it's a little bit predictable in that it's looking for strong edges and things like that. So still doing a lot for you, but you have a little bit of control in some of the use cases of Z-Remesher. But it's not optimal. That's the downside if there is one, but it's used all the time. Also, I'm using it for things like decimating, you know, with Decimation Master, if I want to export high polys out for references or even for baking. And also procedural topology is used for LODs in games. That's something that we used to have to do by hand, but now it's super common to just use some kind of a third-party tool like Simply Gone or something like that and do your reductions of your game characters procedurally. It's way faster. Since it's far away from camera, you don't need as much control as you do on the LOD0, the main model. Okay, so that's procedural. Now, let's talk a little bit about manually doing it. Obviously, manually meaning doing it by hand. So typically that means drawing or creating a mesh on top of your source mesh. This is also referred to as retopology. Probably seen this like in Maya. You can use Quad Draw. So Maya comes with a tool made for this purpose. And then there are third-party software like Topogun it's an entire software made for this practice. So you get like extra bells and whistles using Topogun, but you have to pay, a separate cost. It's a separate piece of software. So if you're serious about retopology, you're doing a lot of work. It makes sense. But for the most part, you don't need that. And I also know Blender can do retopology. But this is generally the practice. You're drawing your polygons on top of some sort of live surface of your source mesh that you made. And you probably made that source mesh with Dynamesh and or Z-Remesher. Okay, so why would you do this? It gives you the most control. You're making polygon by polygon in some cases. You're adding and removing and editing every edge. So this means for production models, it's essential. Still, all series productions essentially do this unless, for some reason they can be wasteful and in some cases maybe you could do that. But for games, every polygon counts, really. That's becoming a little bit less the case, but still, it's not very common to procedurally generate meshes that are going to be used in some kind of game production. So the downside to this, obviously, time consuming. The most time consuming way to make topology, but gives you the most control. So it's the most optimal mesh usually, right? It's the best for deformation. It's just the right amount of polygons that supports your shape without being too wasteful. So the silhouette is clean and it can animate and you're left with an optimal amount of polygons, which you wouldn't be able to as easily get with procedural modeling.
So those are the common ways of making meshes, from auto-generating it and just not caring about it that much because it's all about the shape, to the far end where it is about the topology. So if you're making a real-time mesh that's meant to deform and animate, the best way is to do it by hand because it gives you the most control. So you're going to make an optimal mesh. It animates as good as it can, and it's like as close to the budget as possible. And that's how you get the most efficient mesh that does as much as it can do. And we'll do a little quick example of what that would look like in practice. Okay, so how do you determine a poly count? That's a tricky one. Probably the most common question that I get. And that's, unfortunately impossible to answer. The real answer is it depends, which, is kind of unsatisfactory, and understandably so. So let's talk a little bit about what it depends on and how you can better determine what a optimum poly count is for your particular model.
Okay, so the poly count. How can you determine a poly count for your model? It's very situational, so there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all, but this is the overall strategy. Now, in an efficient model, one that's built optimally and isn't super wasteful, but one specific, like game characters or efficient rendered models, the topology is really serving three major important things, and that's the deformation, the silhouette, and the detail of this model. The deformation, can it animate believably? Does it look good when it's moving around? Does it have enough loops to do that? Okay, check. Silhouette, is it jagged or is it smooth enough to be believable? The textures are going to take care of the inside details, but does the model overall have enough to support the three-dimensional look of the character and in a way that isn't noticeably faceted? Okay, and then the detail. Does the model or character have some costume elements or props or weapons or little details like glasses or jewelry or something that require in a disproportionate amount of polygons so that it looks believable? Okay, rather than talk about numbers, we're going to think about this as proportional, all right? Since every model is going to be different, but if you think of the proportions of what the overall poly count is, it might look something like this. Deformation is priority, maybe priority number one, but doesn't take up a majority of the poly count because it's just, are there enough loops on the joints? That doesn't take a large amount. It's just placed properly. Now, silhouette's going to take a little bit more depending on your character too. Maybe it's got a lot of hair. Maybe it's got round elements in armor or something. And then detail could take a disproportionate amount. So let's say your polygons are spread out like this. Well, we have a budget. So our overall poly count might come in high. If you don't have a budget, you have to set a budget.
Per game, per character, everything is so different. My general suggestions to people is if you're making a character for a portfolio, then I would do it anywhere between 50,000 and 200,000 triangles. Now, I know that's a big range because why not? I mean, every year it gets better and faster. If you make a character between 1 and 200,000 triangles, it should look pretty good. And so that's generally what I would recommend to people. If you're making a certain type of character that's for other games, like, an Overwatch type of thing, a Fortnite type of style, then you don't need, 200,000 would be wasteful. Really, a lot of the poly count will come from the hair or how smooth everything looks. And that's really for certain, particular types of characters. So you don't really always need that many. So that's why I give such a broad range. So it's kind of depending on the style of character that you're doing, and you try to get it within that range, and then it would be reasonable in a portfolio, in my opinion. All right, so that's my most general answer to what a poly count should be. So you can kind of think of it as your overall poly count is like a point system that you're allocating to the most important parts of the model.
And that's what's going to determine where you start placing these points. Then you're going to have to start taking away to get our overall budget down. Now, you don't want to take them away from deformation first. Like I say, that's a priority. You want it to be able to animate. That's the whole point. And the silhouette needs to still look pretty good. So what are you going to take the most from? It's going to be detail. And you're going to take away topology in places that aren't focal points, like below the belt and shoes and things like that. It maybe they have some props on their back. So it depends on the game and the camera. But you're going to start where the camera doesn't see it most often, and you're going to start taking away tiny details that would be nice to have. So when that happens, then we start to get below the budget, and now maybe our ratio looks like this. But this is how you're going to finalize your poly count. You're not just going to build your low poly and then it's done. You're going to build your low poly in a reasonable way, try to make as best predictions as you can, but ultimately there's going to be like a cutting phase at the end when you're really trying to get specific. So with experience comes kind of a general understanding of how high a mesh will be as you're making it, but you're almost always going to come in over, and that's really what you want because it's easier to remove than to add. So it's even good to come in a little over and bake it because the textures will line up to the high poly a lot better, and then you cut it to get it down below budget. Whether you're making an object or a character that's meant to deform, or you're making a character for a game or a cinematic or something, you're going to make different decisions on your topology. So let's talk about the difference between making a character for offline rendering, cinematics, movies, things like that, and then games. So we'll continue on with games for a little bit since we're already talking about it. In games, it's typically going to be lower, obviously, and when it's actually rendered in the engine with the GPU, the entire model is thought of vertices and triangles. So that's why in games we measure the polycount in triangles. That's also why it's totally normal to use triangles when you make your game characters. Now, you don't want to triangulate your game character. That would make it really difficult to UV map, to select edge loops and edit the model. So we still are typically modeling in mostly quads. But because it's going to be triangles anyway, it's really common that you'll use triangles to end edges to make things cheaper, because obviously that's the name of the game when it comes to making real-time art. But also you'll sometimes add a triangle yourself so that you know exactly how a polygon will be split. Because if you leave it up to the renderer, it might rotate the edge in a direction that you don't necessarily want. So sometimes you are adding triangles to make sure you're getting the right shape that you want. Now, with models for offline rendering, cinematics, and all that stuff, it's typical that the mesh will subdivide on render, or at least what is being rigged and what's being skinned and animated and modeled is not the final polycount version. It'll be subdivided, okay? So it's really important that the mesh is quadded out, because when you subdivide a quad, you get 4 polygons and it's very predictable. So if you're doing animation on something that's made with quads and you subdivide it, it'll look more smooth. Triangles don't subdivide very well, which in games case is fine because it's not ever going to be subdivided. But in the case of offline rendering, it's not going to be great. It's going to start to make the mesh messy. It's going to add like pinches and stuff. And because you're not having this perfect square that's subdivided, then things like your displacement map aren't going to move the vertices in a predictable way that you're going to want. So it just causes problems. So if triangles are used on a mesh for offline rendering, they just hide them, put them in the bottom of the feet or between the fingers or behind the ears or whatever, something like that. You definitely don't want to have triangles on all the squishy parts that move around. So that's why we measure triangles for game characters, whereas for offline rendering and, like how high, how many polygons is your high poly model, that type of stuff, we just typically are counting polygons, which are usually quads. So let's talk about high poly models. That is the beginning stage of almost everything. Most of the time you're going to spend as a modeler is making high poly models. One of the things about high poly models is really the poly count doesn't matter. What you need from a high poly model is just enough polygons to hold the detail that you need for that specific model that you're making, and no more. And it needs to be able to run on your machine in a reasonable, amount of time so that you can sculpt on it. And that's it. So the number doesn't matter. It could be 5 million, it could be 10 million, doesn't matter. Just make it as high as you need. Don't go higher because it's just wasteful. It's going to make everything slower. So if you don't need tiny little pores, then you don't need it. And if you have a jacket or something, you don't need, 20 million polygons. High poly models are made for the shape and for sculpting. And that's it. It doesn't have anything to do with deformation because this is about high poly models. This is about a source mesh that you will derive production meshes and textures from. One of the most common ways to make final meshes that become these high poly models is to use Z-remesher. So we talked about manually doing topology for production ready meshes when optimal poly count is important. Well, in high poly models, optimal poly count isn't important. What's important is the shape and the sculpting, right? So Z-remesher is made for this purpose. It makes geometry quickly that takes into account the shape and does its best to evenly distribute polygons on it.
Okay, last thing about high poly models is subdivisions. Use subdivisions. None of this super high resolution Dynamesh stuff. You want to use subdivisions so that you have the most control. It follows the principles that we talked about before, which is having topology that reinforces the form that you're after helps enable you to create clean, polished forms and surfaces more easily without the resistance of having just that generic topology. Being able to subdivide lets you get up and start to create details, and at any time you can drop all the way down and work on primary forms. Subdivisions can also serve as a proxy in ZBrush, so the entire scene moves faster too. So those are the main differences in topology for high poly models. Now we can look at more production models. All right, now let's look at some examples. All right, so some of you may know I recently published my base meshes that I made for my own work so that people that wanted to use those or just buy a base mesh can get them. And so because of that, I've got my own base meshes, my own topology that I spent a long time on. So I thought, let's use it as an example for this. So I'll just briefly touch on a few of the principles that we discussed, and I'll show you how I implemented them. And then I'll show you a couple, I guess, unique-ish things that I ended up doing to my base mesh, and I can explain the reasons why. That might give you some idea on something that you might want to do in your model. So important off the top to try and convey what I wanted to accomplish with this base mesh is that it would be enough to render in real time and look pretty good, but then also I can subdivide it and sculpt on it. It's my preferred way of working on organic characters. If I can, I'd like to make the high poly model or the subdivision level 1 the actual real-time mesh. That way they're connected. So I'm only doing the topology once. So it's kind of serving both purposes as the render mesh and the base mesh. So when I can do that, I will, and that's what I'm doing with this. This will be what I subdivide and then work on. So because of that, you know, down in here, I'm making the polygons pretty evenly spaced like a grid. Now this helps with sculpting because, you know, just like pixels in a canvas, you want them to be similar size. So like if I sculpt veins and wrinkles, then I have a similar resolution over the whole hand as I subdivide. So same is true of the face, though I can't make it all even because just how faces are pretty complicated. You can see like because of deformation, it makes more sense for me to have more loops around the eye and the mouth. So we're starting to get rectangles, you know, rather than like square polygons, which is okay, but it's just something that is worth noting. I think that's fine, but that's why I have some more faces than I need. But in general, we're getting to a space now where real-time meshes don't have to be, you know, super cheap. So I still don't think this is very high, but this definitely could render. And, you know, if I showed you without any lighting whatsoever, it still looks pretty smooth. You know, for the most part, the head looks smooth, which is an important part. The arms look pretty smooth. The fingers look okay. So it doesn't look stand out-ish. You know, it doesn't look like really polygonal. So that's good. You can see little jaggies here if you really look. But for the most part, this is my kind of minimum for most things. Now, I could also use this for some kind of pre-rendered. I mean, I could easily just smooth this once and get 4 times as many. And now all of a sudden, this is going to be totally fine, more than I need. So depending on my purpose, I can do that. So I want it to be as versatile as possible. Okay, so other than the amount of polygons and the size, you can see the general flow here is pretty easy, right? This is all horizontal because she can bend back and forth. Same with the elbow. You can see it's already getting a little bit of the bend in there. Now on the joints that bend like this, that just bend in one direction, pretty easy way to think of it is you just want to make it just like a grid, just like a bendy straw. You know, you want to have some edges, and as it bends, you want to be able to have more edges so that when it does bend, it still looks smooth. If you didn't have that many edges, then all of a sudden, when it's starting to bend, you know, it starts to look sharper. And that's not what you want when you see these facets right here. Even now, it's getting a little pointed on the elbow, but I think that's fine. It is an elbow. I even have an extra loop here to surround the elbow bone so that when she does a full extension, hopefully this shape can still be supported. The chest, you may notice, isn't as round as it could be. That's fine with me because I did make this base mesh universal. This is the same topology for my male shape as my female shape that we're looking at right here. And I don't plan on ever doing a character that is 100% topless or anything like that. That would be a custom model. You know, with the fact that she would be wearing some kind of costume or clothing. I could always rip the arms off if she was fully covered. So I'm not even using this body mesh other than maybe a shape to make clothing on top of. So that's not really a problem at all. All right, so now I'm just going to point out a few, somewhat unique things that I did to my base mesh, and I can give you a couple reasons why I did that. First, we can just start with the head. Is if you notice, I have some stars here. Stars are vertices that have 5 edges coming from them. Typically, it's indicative of a direction change. It's just a lot of polygons, and so there's the flow is kind of turning. So you do need to have stars for the most part if you're going to have a mesh that has quads. This has quads everywhere. Game meshes are going to be triangles, right? So that's not a problem if you use triangles. But because this mesh is meant to be versatile, when I'm sculpting on it, I don't want triangles. And if I'm doing subdivisions on render for displacement maps, I don't really want triangles. So why not do quads? It's also easier to make selections and UV map and stuff like that. But here you can see these are all direction changes. Here's some more stars. These are all direction changes without using triangles. So back to her neck. So yeah, you can see some stars here. Now this is because I have this head split like this. I wanted to be able to have the head with enough room to have neck holes and stuff if I wanted to detach the head and still have a little bit of the chest. So I prefer doing it this way rather than having concentric circles go down lower and lower and lower. And also the shoulder right here has its own lines so that she can raise her arm, right? And then this gets to compress, and then this stretches out right here on the underside. So I'm getting the lines here for deformation. I'm getting the topology here that's going to flow from her chest over to the top of her deltoid. Again, when she lifts her arm up, hopefully it keeps that shape. That way you can keep the bump here. And you can even see on the underside, I actually just used it to reinforce the armpit shape. So as she moves around, hopefully this will still be able to deform. The shoulders are a big point of deformation and stretching in characters. So really a lot goes on the technical animator being able to have supporting bones and good skin weighting and stuff like that. But this is just a way that I reinforced it with some extra geo and kept the flow going without using triangles. So you can see here, if you pay attention, that you can see some more stars. Star right here, star right here. This isn't necessarily a star, but it's a direction change. So let's take a look at some of the stars on the face. So with these stars or poles, a vert with 5 edges, it can cause some tension in the mesh visibly, actually, when you're smoothing it. It'll just feel sharp. So it's not going to be as smooth as this area right here. When it's subdivided, it's going to be super smooth, not a problem at all. But, stars like this could. And when you're sculpting it, it's not as easy to get the exact shape that you want. So when making faces, it's best practice to strategically place where you're putting these stars. So I'll explain why I chose where I chose. This is just a direction change, not really a star, but you can see I wanted a forehead with lines like this so that it can compress. So she can raise her eyebrows and furrow them. So it's best if the forehead is a grid, in my opinion. And then so I just have this flow come around so that it can meet up with the eyes, which are concentric circles, concentric rings, which is good. Same with the mouth. The mouth and the eye are both very similar in that they are rings going outward. So it can do the squashing and stretching and stuff, and it can look around. The nose is really just about holding the shape. There's some deformation here. Right here, you can see the flow come around. So instead of the concentric rings from the mouth, we end here, and now we're coming up over the nose. So this is if you raise your cheeks and stuff, you can create these shapes. So you have to have these polygons and able to make some of these shapes if you're going to do blend shapes and things like that. So it's important that you have the edge flow echo the facial shapes or the direction a face can slide around. On top of that, it's extra geo here that's maintaining the shape of the head, looking good while it's rendered in all angles. So it's serving dual purposes. So where I place these poles, right here and right here and right here and right here. Now I put them here because I heard a good tip a while ago that if you have to put a pole somewhere on a face, it's good to put it in an area that doesn't deform that much or already is somewhat hard. You know, by that I mean like a bone or something. So here we have this temple, doesn't move that much either. I think it's a perfect place for a direction change. This, just trying to find a space in between, like I said, like here's a section that deforms, right? And then here is a section that deforms. This is like what would make the crow's feet, and like if you're doing a big smile. And then we have the jaw, which can open. So this area right here can swing open. So it's a good place to put it because you have these different sections that are kind of moving in different ways in their major directions. But then also I kind of think of a place right here is kind of a good spot because it's really just floating around. I'm not doing a lot of crazy detail right there. So for me, it made sense to put it right there. Right here, I'm thinking maybe kind of like the orbital bone. Again, like we have this squashy eyelids around the eyes, and then we have like a cheekbone and it's coming in different directions. So I feel like this is a fine place to put it. If there's a little bit of a corner on it, I think that's okay. Most of this stuff, by the way, not that perceivable. This is just the super like geeky stuff that you'll get into once you've made several base meshes and you're just trying to get the perfect mesh. Something I think is probably worth pointing out and calling out here is this kind of structure here. I wouldn't do this if I was doing a mesh purely for sculpting purposes, and I wouldn't do this if it was for offline rendering only. I really only added this here for facial animation at this resolution if I were to use this as a real-time mesh. And that's to get the squash of the brow so that we can move the brows in this direction and get this to kind of compress and make a wrinkle right here. Other than that, I would have just like had the lines come up, you know? That would be the simplest way, but I put it there. Again, you can see some stars or some poles, and those I feel like are the perfect place to hide these because there's going to be eyebrows right here. So you can almost never see them when they're placed right here. I've seen them placed in other places if they're too high. You know, it might be a problem if they're up here. So I always try to put them right here if I can. Same with the ones down here. Again, like the nose isn't moving too much. It's kind of like a solid structure right there. So that's why I put those there as well. So you can see the line flowing underneath the structure of the neck, the ear, the topology. If you notice some poles again, and what that is kind of doing is making a kind of a section here. So the ear's on its own island. And that's how I model it, so that I can have topology that supports the structure of the ear. The ear doesn't animate, so it's purely for the form of it. So really what I'm trying to do is stitch together these sections that I know have to be a certain way, you know, and then I'm getting like even flow in between, and then I'm trying to stitch them together and finding ways to like route edge flow if I need to, if I have some extra edges or something. But the ear, kind of a good example of edge flow that's purely for the model and the structure of it and not for deformation at all. All right, so this is my base mesh and some of the reasons why I did some of the things I did. Now let's take a look at a couple of examples of meshes that I think are not too good. Okay, so here is the demo head from ZBrush. This comes with ZBrush. It comes with a couple base mesh tools that you can use to get started. So I thought we could look in here and see if we could pick some things that could be better. Overall, it's not too bad, I don't think. The main things that stand out to me are the neck. I mean, this one kind of stands out. Obviously, they put the poles in different places, which is fine, but there's like the direction of the flow, you know, is not supporting the shape that much. It's being stretched out here to conform to where they want, you know, essentially to conform to this part probably. So I think that could be better. It's actually kind of going against the flow of the tendon of the neck and the muscles. So I would do that a little bit differently. You can see we do have some concentric rings here around the mouth, which is good to see. This is the best way to do a mouth. I might go a little bit more, but this is not so bad. Then we have this star here that actually has like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 edges. I think that's way too much stress on this one vert. So you can even see like the flow, how it takes a sharp turn, and the difference between this face and this face You know, it's really big. So I think I would probably add some more topology here and change the flow. There's even a change in direction here on the bridge of the nose. I assume to support the bridge of the nose, but I think we could still do that by having like the edge rings going over the nose. It would also help with animation and deformation, like if you're doing snarls, raising the nose, squashing, that kind of thing, like intense frowns and stuff. Right now, we don't really have topology that would reinforce shapes like that. It looks like it's built more for the static shape than it is for if it deformed. Even right here, putting this star right here isn't so good because we want to have this shape right here of the nasal labial fold so that when the face does this, you can get that crease, you can get that compression of the forms of the cheek and everything, you know. I don't know, is this helping? But you know what I'm saying. So I don't think that's a great place for a star, and I wouldn't want to do a vert that has so many edges anyways. Definitely want to loosen that up and just get the flow a little bit nicer like this, and probably just cross the nose. The ear's okay. Doesn't have a lot of the internal structure supported. Probably do that in sculpt though. But yeah, so that's this mesh. Then let's take a look at one that I think is worse. All right, so this is the Julie mesh from ZBrush. Also comes free. I think this has subdivision, so it's probably, you know, you probably wouldn't want to start with this one. I mean, you could always dynamesh it, but you can see here how the ear is just totally botched. You can tell that the topology was just made simply, and the ear was attempted to be built out of that. So in this kind of case, you'd have to subdivide a lot in ZBrush to get enough topology in here to make the ear shapes. And you'd have to fight the topology a bit to like tuck it and make those convex forms. So by not having the topology like reinforce the shape, be built custom for an ear, it's going to be a lot more difficult to sculpt and model. And obviously you lose it completely unless you have a very high subdivision level. So I think that's no bueno. And then we can see the mouth here has some problems first, right? But also we don't have those concentric rings to make like a kiss face or like a big smile. Right here, the edge flow just comes off this way, and it wouldn't support like, you know, this kind of cheek shape. You wouldn't be able to get the puffy cheeks of a smile. Making like a kissy face would be almost impossible. So this is an example of topology that deformation would not be good. It's definitely was not made with deformation in mind, and it looks like it was made probably for high poly models. It was probably made so that you could sculpt a static shape, but I still think you could make topology for this purpose a lot better if the structure of the mesh supported the shape it was trying to be more, like in the ears case and like in the nose's case. You know, by not having the nostril like reinforced with edge loops, then you have to sculpt everything, and you're going to be fighting against this grid-like shape rather than an actual like circular shape that's reinforced with the topology itself. All right, so there's a couple examples of topology I think are not so good. And while we're on the subject, I want to recommend a couple books if you want to get more deep into topology for animation and of faces. There's the book Stop Staring by Jason Osipa, which I've recommended before. I've read that book and I like it a lot. Not only does it talk about good techniques and principles for edge flow for facial animation, but also it talks about modeling a face, modeling a base mesh for a face. So I recommend that book to any character artist starting out or someone that's interested in making characters for facial animation. Another book that you can get, which is a somewhat famous ebook, is this one, The Art of Moving Points by Brian Tyndall. So in this book, it's a digital book, like I say, but it's even got some videos. Let's see if we'll see a video here. Oh, here we go. So here's a topology laid out. You can see these sections, the concentric rings that we're talking about, and they describe the sections and what they do and why you'd want to build them that way. So great reference. This book is really good. It was recommended to me by an animator. And you can see, because it's a digital book, there's even some videos, which I can't play right now, but trust me, there's videos. All right, I want to take a moment to thank this video's sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare is an awesome online learning resource with tons of videos on all different kinds of subjects. So if you're interested in learning stuff and you've got an interest in anything that you want to know more about, Skillshare is a great place to check it out. I watch all kinds of different videos that are somewhat related to my interests, somewhat not. I'm just curious and I like to look into stuff. One of those things is this logo design with Aaron Draplin. I've seen his other videos on the site, and even though I don't think I'm a graphic designer, I love hearing about graphic design and his passion. I also love the way the videos are made. But there's a ton of different subjects on Skillshare that you could check out for yourself. So really, you could type in anything that you want and see if there's something that you're interested in to learn more about. The first 1,000 people to click the link down below in my description get a 1-month free trial to Skillshare. So you can check this out for yourself, take a few classes, and learn something for free. Ooh, cinematic color grading. Dope. So that is as much about topology as I could think to put in this video for now. So thank you for watching up to this point. I hope you learned something that you could apply to your own models. I'll have an art-related video coming out pretty soon, so stay tuned for that. But thank you for watching, and go out there and make some cool models. Till next time, peace out.